When you break down the Ottoman army's composition, the situation becomes clearer and more understandable. Janissaries acted as the elite infantry corps, professional slave soldiers raised from childhood for military service. Sipahi units provided the main heavy cavalry from the Ottoman feudal cavalry system. Akıntı troops filled the crucial role of swift, mobile light cavalry for scouting and harassment. Altogether, Ottoman sources suggest the invasion force fielded approximately 30,000 cavalry of various types. However, the Ottoman army was already in serious trouble before a single arrow was fired at Vaslui. Their problem started months earlier during the assembly and march phase. The entire invasion force assembled in Sofia in September 1474. And from there, the march northward took a full brutal month through increasingly hostile terrain and worsening weather. They crossed the frozen Danube River literally on ice, pushing heavy wagons and thousands of horses across a river turned into a treacherous ice sheet, risking catastrophic breakthrough that could drown hundreds. Thousands of men marching through constant sleet and frozen mud, day after miserable day with barely enough rest, because Suleiman Pasha faced an impossible deadline: defeat Stephen before winter weather locks the entire region down completely, or face the Sultan's wrath for failure. You can imagine how that intense political pressure trickled down through the command structure, creating rushed decisions and exhausted troops. By the time Ottoman forces even reached Moldavian territory, they weren't fresh, eager warriors. They were exhausted, hungry, and critically undersupplied. But that's only part of the logistical nightmare story. The Ottomans weren't traveling alone as a unified force. They picked up a Wallachian vassal army of approximately 17,000 men led by Basarab Lyota, the Ottoman-backed ruler. That addition boosts your total numbers significantly, but it also dramatically increases the daily requirements for food: tents, horses, firewood, and medical supplies. And Wallachian loyalty during this unstable period was questionable at best. These weren't enthusiastic volunteers fighting for a cause they believed in. Then there was the often overlooked non-combat contingent, nearly 20,000 Bulgarian peasants and support workers conscripted for clearing roads, building temporary bridges over frozen streams, and hauling the endless supplies required by a massive pre-modern army. These civilians were absolutely essential for moving a huge force through winter terrain. But they also made the marching column far larger, slower, and exponentially more vulnerable to disruption. Imagine a line of people and wagons stretching for miles, with perhaps half of them completely unarmed and defenseless. One well-timed ambush by fast-moving cavalry could throw the entire logistical train into chaos, stranding the combat units without food or ammunition. And that kind of disruptive, asymmetric warfare was exactly Stephen the Great's specialty. He had perfected it over nearly 2 decades of frontier combat. Stephen had assembled approximately 40,000 Moldavian soldiers through maximum mobilization, an enormous effort for such a small principality that required calling up virtually every able-bodied man. Among them were 5,000 Zeykelis Hungarian warrior settlers from Transylvania known for fierce independence. Between 2,000 and 5,000 Wallachians, likely anti-Ottoman factions, about 2,000 Polish auxiliary cavalry, and around 1,800 Hungarian troops. These numbers weren't massive compared to the Ottoman invasion force, but they brought crucial advantages: combat experience, tactical specialization, intimate knowledge of local terrain, and the desperate motivation of defending their homeland. Before a single spear was raised on the battlefield, Stephen was already systematically destroying the Ottoman army through methods they weren't psychologically prepared for. He implemented comprehensive scorched earth tactics, targeting everything the Ottoman army needed to stay alive during winter campaigning. His forces poisoned wells with animal corpses and other contaminants, making water sources deadly. They burned and utterly destroyed food sources in every village along the Ottoman route: granaries, livestock, stored vegetables. They systematically wiped out supply depots and destroyed bridges to slow the advance. Stephen understood with crystal clarity that an army marching through hostile territory in January was already hungry, freezing, and exhausted from the elements. If he made every single mile northward just a little more miserable, denied them every comfort and necessity, the Ottomans would reach the decisive battlefield, already half defeated by privation, before combat even began. If you study a topographical map of Moldavia carefully, you can see how the landscape naturally folds into valleys, hills, and lowlands with strategic choke points. Stephen selected one specific location called Podul Inalt, meaning the high bridge just outside the town of Vaslui, a long apseded, narrow valley with broad marshy ground, thanks to winter snow melting and refreezing, the Burlad River cutting directly through it, and soft mud everywhere from the constant freeze-thaw cycle. In pure military terms, this terrain was a tactical nightmare for any large army, but especially devastating for one heavily dependent on cavalry mobility. Why? Because the Ottoman invasion force relied overwhelmingly on approximately 30,000 cavalry of various types. And cavalry formations absolutely need space to function effectively. Horses need room to maneuver at speed, charge in coordinated waves, and regroup after contact. In a wide open field or plain, those cavalry wings could sweep across the battlefield like scissors cutting paper, enveloping and destroying enemy formations. Moldavia couldn't risk that scenario under any circumstances, given their numerical disadvantage. At Podul Inalt, the valley topography worked like a natural funnel or bottleneck. Instead of spreading wide across a broad plain in their preferred formation, the massive Ottoman army was squeezed into a narrow column, forced to move forward in depth rather than width. One military historian aptly described it as trying to push an elephant through a keyhole. The Ottoman numerical superiority became a liability rather than an advantage. And Stephen, with brilliant tactical foresight, turned that geographic keyhole into a carefully prepared kill zone. January 10, Iten Sibai Tishawu. Dawn. The morning of the decisive battle. The entire Podul Inalt Valley was covered in thick winter fog, the kind of dense, disorienting fog where you can barely see 10 paces ahead through the white murk. Anyone who has driven through heavy fog knows how profoundly disorienting it becomes. Now imagine being an Ottoman soldier in completely unfamiliar territory, surrounded by thousands of men you cannot see, hearing sounds echoing strangely through the mist, not knowing where enemies might be hiding. Ottoman lines stretched dangerously thin through the narrow valley. Their officers couldn't effectively see where Moldavian forces were positioned, how many defenders awaited them, or what surprises Stephen had prepared. The Moldavian troops were strategically positioned on high ground flanking the valley, partly concealed by terrain and trees, maintaining absolute silence. The thick fog covered everything the 20 cannons carefully positioned on the slopes. The archers hidden in the woods with thousands of arrows ready. the infantry waiting patiently behind temporary wooden defenses. The fog also covered the Ottoman army as they advanced, but for them it became a curse rather than an advantage. Once enough Ottoman infantry had pushed deep into the valley funnel, believing they faced only token resistance, the trap closed with devastating suddenness. Stephen's 20 cannons hidden along both slopes opened fire simultaneously. Imagine the psychological shock of hearing the roar of concentrated artillery fire from multiple directions you cannot see through the fog. Those iron cannonballs landed in tightly packed Ottoman infantry columns with nowhere to scatter in the narrow valley. Men crushed. Limbs torn off. Panic spreading instantly. In that confined space, cannonballs worked like bowling balls, smashing through densely packed crowds. The Janissaries, normally the disciplined backbone of Ottoman military power, were suddenly taking catastrophic casualties without even seeing where the deadly fire originated from. Right after the initial cannon barrage came the storm of arrows. Crossbow bolts and arrows rained down from 3 directions simultaneously: front, left ridge, right ridge. It was a coordinated crossfire so intense that some chronicles dramatically said the sky darkened from the sheer volume of projectiles. And remember, the Ottomans couldn't form proper defensive formations with interlocking shields because the valley terrain was too restricted and visibility too poor. Panic began replacing discipline as men died from unseen attackers. When the Ottoman line started visibly buckling under the crossfire and artillery barrage, Stephen unleashed his cavalry in the fog. The Viteji and Kurteni, his elite heavy horsemen in full armor, and the Kalarashi, his fast-moving light cavalry perfectly suited for pursuit, sending them forward in a carefully coordinated surge through the chaos. They crashed into the Ottoman flanks and rear, emerging suddenly from the fog like ghosts. In that single devastating moment of contact, the entire Ottoman formation began to psychologically unravel. What followed was chaos on a scale few armies could withstand and survive with cohesion. Thick fog reducing visibility to nothing. Knee-deep mud-trapping men and horses. Deafening noise from cannons and screaming. Constant crossfire from invisible positions, all of it combined to swallow the battlefield in nightmare conditions. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers found themselves unable to retreat effectively. The narrow valley prevented it. Unable to reorganize into defensive formations, officers couldn't see their units, and often unable even to understand where attacks were coming from through the fog. Once a medieval army breaks, once unit cohesion snaps completely and primal fear takes over, the battle is effectively finished as organized resistance. What remains is pursuit and slaughter. Stephen's forces turned the foggy valley into a slaughterhouse. Ottoman casualties, depending on which historical source you trust, climbed as high as 40,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Many soldiers drowned in the ice-cold Berlad River during the panicked retreat northward, dragged under by the weight of armor and equipment. Others were methodically cut down during the desperate, chaotic chase that continued for miles. When you compare those casualty figures side by side, approximately 40,000 Ottoman versus approximately 5,000 Moldavian, you realize just how catastrophically lopsided this engagement truly became. It was one of the worst military disasters the Ottoman Empire suffered in the entire 15th century, comparable only to their failure at Belgrade in 1456. The Ottoman command structure took massive, irreplaceable losses. 4 pashas, high-ranking commanders with decades of battlefield experience, were killed in the chaos. Hundreds of Ottoman military standards, the elite unit flags that symbolized regimental honor, were captured as trophies. Losing soldiers is one thing, but losing experienced leaders and sacred symbols is another mine. It's psychological spine-breaking. Even the elite Janissaries panicked and broke under the artillery fire, fog, and mud. Stephen made the victory's message unmistakably brutal through psychological warfare. Polish chronicler Jan Długosz recorded that all Turkish prisoners except the highest ranking were impaled and their bodies burned. A deliberate terror message to Ottoman vassals. Sultan Mehmed II was stunned. Even his stepmother, Mara Brankovic, said the Ottomans had never suffered a greater defeat. The disaster forced cancellation of the planned Hungarian invasion. Mehmed returned in 1476 with an even larger army and defeated Stephen at Valea Alba, but still failed to conquer Moldavia due to fortress sieges and supply problems. Pope Sixtus IV praised Stephen as true champion of the Christian faith, despite Orthodox Catholic divide, and sent financial support. Vaslui proved the Ottomans weren't invincible and gave Moldavia prestige that ensured Western support for decades. Subscribe to Great History for more battles where terrain exploitation and scorched earth tactics defeated overwhelming numerical superiority.